Attack on Titan's final season really puts Jean in a much bigger role. I certainly did not expect this douche from season 1 to grow into arguably the most relatable character on the whole show, or for him to become even remotely heroic. After reclaiming Shiganshina, we see Jean helping the Survey Corps in industrializing Paradise Island. And he, along with everyone else, wants peace with the outside world. Jean, despite still being cocky and sort of puffed up, is still only interested in that peaceful, dreamy life inside the walls. And you can't really blame him for just wanting all the fighting to be over. But he, along with all the others, recognize the uneasiness of Paradise's position on a global scale. Most people don't want any subjects of Ymir around at all. The subject of who will inherit Eren's Titan comes up during this time, and Jean volunteers to take it. For him, I think he largely volunteers because he doesn't want Mikasa's life to be potentially shortened should she try to take it. Though Connie actually stops him by telling Jean that he too is valuable. Too valuable a leader, in fact, to be lost within 13 short years. Which is something nobody in season 1 would have ever thought anybody would say to Jean. Marco's words and belief in him still lives on. Not even just in Jean at this point, it's being reflected in the people around him. It's important to note that at this point, Connie is arguably Jean's closest friend, along with Sasha. After all, Jean, Connie, and Sasha are all very alike in the sense that they are just 3 normal people trying to do their best. Armin has his great intelligence, as does Hanji. Eren is a Titan, Mikasa is a mutant. These 3 are like us. They all relate to each other in being extraordinarily ordinary. And I think that's why Sasha and Connie are very important to Jean at this time. Doing the right thing is absolutely one big motivation for Jean, but having to have your friends' backs, especially Connie and Sasha, in a life or death situation, is a whole other motivation. Jean has close friends now, and he wants to protect them. We see the depth of this friendship in how Jean and Connie and Sasha all share the same brain cell in Marley, and it is very sweet. It's really nice that Jean has his found family after so many years of likely being a bit of a loner. But it's unfortunate that their visit in Marley is soured when they realize that the rest of the world absolutely wants them dead. The chances for peace are extremely slim, and for Jean, it's like his dream life behind the walls is being taken away from him again. The goalposts have been moved. We see Jean again in Paradise's attack on Liberio, now as a respected commander and expert soldier. Jean does not want to be there at all, as he's not a fan of violence. He still has his fears and reluctance, but as Jean has matured, so have his principles. Jean's main concern and motivation is protecting his friends and comrades, as well as stopping excess violence against civilians. But of course, Jean's desire to hold on to his humanity here is hard to balance in these 2 ways. While Jean takes life with far more ease than before, he hesitates when it comes to shooting at Peak and Falco, because he doesn't want to harm a kid. Death is not a means to an end thing for Jean, and he doesn't view it as a patriotic thing either, like Flock. He still lives with that mindset of questioning what victory is even worth. And while Jean still manages to shoot, he wonders if he missed because of his own reservations, not just the steam coming from Peak's Titan. Even while some are celebrating with Flock after the battle, Jean is agonizing over how many more people they're probably going to have to kill because of this attack. After Gabby shoots Sasha, one of Jean's closest friends, one of the people that he resolved to protect with his own life, he still ultimately resists the urge to throw Gabby out of the blimp. But after the heat of the moment passes, he's not motivated by vengeance, even when everybody, Flock loudest of all, is calling for revenge. Jean is still not somebody who is easily influenced by others. He still sees in death those ashen bones that he sifted from Marco's pyre. Killing is not his first course of action, and he does not take it lightly. He's always asking himself these moral questions, always working to retain his humanity. Floch at this point is a great sort of opposite to see what Jean is like and what he could have been. Even in his grief, Jean drags Gabby to his superiors so she can be dealt with more humanity than any of his comrades would offer. And it's not like he wasn't tempted to throw Gabby off the ship, but he still held himself together under these powerful emotions. We see Jean go from lashing out and willing to beat the crap out of those guys in the headquarters, to him managing to hold himself together all alone in a really bad situation. Marco isn't there to hold him back anymore, and Jean still manages for his own sake, as well as for the sake of 2 kids. And of course, after Sasha is pronounced dead, Jean is heartbroken. But he's still there to remind Eren about just how much his actions and choices still affect his old regiment. Jean tells Eren that Sasha's death is his fault. He's the one who dragged them into this attack after all. And Jean is right. Even in grief, he's still spitting facts. It's made even worse by the fact that it was Sasha who died. Like, oh my god. As political tensions rise in Paradis, Jean's realist mindset becomes extremely vital in keeping his friends on the same page. Because Jean, unlike Mikasa and even Armin, with all his smarts, can once again see the writing on the wall that they don't want to accept. Connie is especially angry because of how close he was to Sasha, and then Floch gets arrested for leaking top-secret information about Eren. Jean, typically a realistic guy, is surrounded by people of various extreme opinions, some that are in denial, and some that just don't know what to do. As the Jaegerists take over, Jean is imprisoned with those closest to him. Eren is now running things, and he seems to have gone completely cold. But yet again, Jean still manages to keep a level head when he finds out that Eren attacked Armin and terribly hurt Mikasa's feelings. Despite his initial defensiveness and anger on Mikasa's behalf, Jean is able to see what Armin and Mikasa can't. That it's very likely Eren was so cruel to them for a hidden motive. Jean is still smart enough to know that when he's adding 1 and 1 together, he's still getting 3. Something is going on. When Armin argues that Eren will likely activate the rumbling, but a small-scale one as to only protect the island from Marley, Jean has some degree of doubt about this. He knows there's something fishy going on. This all calls back to Jean's natural distaste for idealism and how unrealistic it can become. Armin and even Mikasa, due to how much they love Eren and are struggling to accept the very different person he's become, are using idealism and hope to cope. Jean's got a bad feeling about this, but he still goes out with his friends to try to help Eren. You understand why. They don't just want to let Eren die, and also Marley's attacking. If they don't help Eren, then they will likely be destroyed by Marley. They're kind of between a rock and a hard place, and they still don't have all the answers yet. But, as Jean suspected, Eren activates the rumbling, and it is not a small-scale one, it is the big boy. And Jean is still shocked, despite how suspicious he was. Nobody wants to think their friend has turned into a genocidal maniac. No one wants to think that somebody they served in combat with is now evil, let alone that their helping him was potentially the decision that indirectly led to the deaths of billions. Jean tries to rationalize this by saying that the rumbling is the only way to save Paradis. Perhaps Eren is just being proactive here. But I think for Jean, this is also about protecting his dream. His dream of that peaceful life with that dream girl and their baby. But even this logic is difficult for him to accept. After all, is that peaceful life and that victory worth the anguish of billions. This internal conflict is what makes Jean vulnerable to Floch's offer to join the Jaegerists. He's lured in and tempted by this promise of that perfect little life that Jean always wanted. He can finally stop fighting. He doesn't have to experience any more horrors of war. When Hanji comes to Jean to convince him to help her stop Eren, he tries to convince her to let Eren go ahead with the rumbling. But Jean quickly recognizes how horrible his cheap justification of Eren's actions is, how it stems from old desires and selfish dreams, especially when faced with Mikasa, Jean's dream girl, who is willing to risk it all to try to stop Eren. When Hanji asks him to think of his comrades' memories and what they fought for, Jean thinks of Marco. He thinks of the strength Marco saw in him, as well as Marco's own good nature, a nature that shaped Jean immensely, long after his death. He thinks of those burnt-up bones, and whether or not they would have wanted their sacrifice to end in the suffering of billions, and whether or not he could live the rest of his life knowing that he was complacent. Jean knows he'd be betraying everybody if he didn't at least try to stop the rumbling. Jean sees the error of his ways and agrees to join Hanji and Mikasa, and some of the surviving Marleyans and warriors to take Eren out. But I will say, I think a large part of his reason for changing his mind is Mikasa being there with Hanji. And not just because of Jean's feelings for Mikasa, but rather for what she represents. Jean's relationship with Mikasa is extremely important, as I think it stands as a powerful representation of what truly separates Eren and Jean. And I don't mean in Mikasa being trauma bonded with Eren to the nines and not even blinking in Jean's direction. From the moment Jean first laid eyes on Mikasa at boot camp, he was infatuated with her. He sees the girl from his dream. Part of his initial rivalry with Eren has to do with Mikasa's devotion to him, as well as Eren's tendency to kinda take her for granted in a lot of ways. In the same way Jean's image of the life he's supposed to lead breaks down against reality, so does the idea of his dream girl. This was actually Jean's own kind of idealization, ironically enough. And his acceptance of this fact, the fact of his dream being unrealistic, is a huge part of his growth. And it doesn't just happen overnight. Despite Jean's misgivings about idealism, his greatest battle is his own internal struggle with it. And it's only in that one scene where Hanji and Mikasa force Jean to really check himself and the world around him that Jean is able to finally become stronger than that shiny idea. He surpasses it at last. Throughout Jean's story, he doesn't try to wrestle or change the world to suit his superficial needs or desires, especially not after Trost and Marco's death. He realizes he has to change, or fall apart, as long and arduous a process as that kind of growth will be. This is why he joined the Survey Corps, despite his fears and desires. This is why he begins to let go of his false idea of Mikasa. This is what sets him apart from Eren, I think. Somebody who clings to the world that he's imagined, and who tries to shape the world in his image, so as to not, theoretically, shatter his beliefs. When Jean looks at Mikasa, namely in that discussion where he decides to join Hanji, he sees completely what he thought he wanted just isn't real. Jean realizes that Mikasa is not this dream girl. She is her own person, and I think he knows that who she actually is infinitely more than any dream version of her could be. And he realizes that the man in his daydream just before this scene is also not him anymore. The boy that Jean was in season 1, who was so willing to turn a blind eye and hide from reality for his own benefit, does not exist anymore. A part of him still treasures the sweetness of that dream, especially after all the trauma and horrors of war he's experienced. but it's just not congruent with his core values and how strong and confident he's become. I think his whole story has just been a gradual realization of that fact, but it really fully hits him in this moment. And this doesn't mean that Jean suddenly stops caring for Mikasa. If anything, I think Jean's gradual acknowledgement of how things actually are evolved his teenage infatuation with her to a genuine love. And it's never weird or uncomfortable. Jean just deeply cares for Mikasa. He sees her pain and wishes he could remove it, especially as they get closer to dealing with Eren. And I think, as well, Jean's realization over time has led to Mikasa becoming closer to him. This is why Jean is the only person to really get it through to her that they have to kill Eren to save the world. They have no other choice. The main difference between people who can grow and change and people who don't, from a psychological perspective, it's being able to sit through discomfort. And it's very sad when you think of that because we've seen Jean on an upwards trajectory since season 1. We see him go from punk to commander. We see him go from the kid that everybody made fun of or didn't get along with to being the glue that holds a lot of the scouts together. From colt to stallion. And while Jean does change in extremely important ways, he still retains his caring core values that don't relish in violence, death, or suffering. Or force. I know this section's technically about Mikasa and Jean, but it's interesting when you see that Eren's own plot goes on a downwards trajectory to despair and torment. I think Eren and Jean intersect in terms of how close they are and how much they understand each other by the end of season 3 and that brief period of industrialization after. And the fact that these two actually did become friends before the end makes the ending of Attack on Titan punch a lot more, at least for me. Jean joining up with his buddies from the Survey Corps, General Magath, and the surviving Marleyan warriors is quite the adjustment period, to no one's surprise. Especially with Reiner being among the surviving warriors. Jean is already dealing with conflicted feelings, much like when he first joined the Survey Corps, and it's a struggle for him to convince himself to work alongside traitors. Although Annie was the only one that they knew to have a direct involvement somehow with Marco's death, this kind of got lost in the chaos of everything happening. And Annie had only just gotten out of her crystal. It gets brought up by Yelena at the campfire, and it almost ruins everything. Tensions were already high in this scene, largely due to the General and Jean bickering. But Marco's name is what shuts Jean up. It's only been 4 years since Jean was breaking his sword off of Annie's crystal, the only answers to his questions being the fragments of his blade. When Annie admits to taking Marco's ODM gear and leaving him to die, this is the first time anybody in Paradise knew what happened to him. Marco died 4 years earlier and had a very short runtime on this show, yet his death and his actions still affect characters. However, Reiner swoops in and takes responsibility, saying that he's the one who ordered Annie to do it. And at first, Jean handles this information very well. And this is largely because Reiner is, at this point, just stating the facts, and finally giving Jean and the others the answers they've been denied. It's something to have a degree of consolation, especially when honesty is important for the world-saving team that they're trying to build. What makes Jean snap here is the same thing that made him snap at those soldiers cowering inside the headquarters back in Trost. Reiner begins making this whole admission of guilt about himself, his own remorse, his own pain, and his sorrow. Just as those soldiers made the deaths of those cadets into a mere footnote when compared to their own fears. Reiner doesn't get to stand on top of the dead, to wave around the flag of his own suffering. That's just not fair to Marco, or any of the innocents that he's killed. Marco is not there to hold Jean back this time, and he beats the crap out of Reiner. Reiner doesn't fight him because this is something he's wanted for a very long time, so he has that. Jean only stops when Gabby throws herself over her cousin, taking one of Jean's sharp kicks. This is what brings Jean back to reality, seeing the child who killed his best friend taking that kick and begging him for forgiveness. She blames Marley's own actions, hers included, for Eren starting the rumbling. And she actually starts begging for their help to stop it. Jean is wrestling with his own desire to just walk away and live his life. When he comes back the next morning and apologizes to Gabby and turns over a new leaf with Reiner, this is Jean once again coming through. Though he tells Reiner he can't forgive him, Jean refuses to let down the memories of his comrades and let their deaths be the groundwork for genocide. This is what gives him the strength of will to fight his former comrades as he and his friends fight to escape Paradise Isle. Jean does not hesitate a single time in this battle, showcasing his dedication and resolve. But after taking out all their former comrades, he is still distraught and upset as Flock dies, even after Flock more or less almost screws them over by shooting the plane's fuel tank. It never becomes a case of us versus them for Jean. He never quite sees it that way. Flock was still his comrade and friend for many years. And after Hanji's horrific death, Jean still begs Eren to stop and reconsider, to cease all this death and destruction. He still wants to believe Eren can be reasoned with, though this is ultimately futile. But after taking out all of his former comrades in his attempt to escape Paradise with the scouts, and remembering every innocent in Liberio, and every Marleyan soldier that he and his friends may have killed, Jean has a moment where he levels with Reiner, something no one's ever really done with him before. Jean recognizes how horrible it must have been. Almost echoing Eren's line to Reiner, Jean declares himself not all that different from him. Perhaps, Jean says, maybe he has no right to judge him anyway. Perhaps forgiveness and revenge is out of the question when there is no moral high ground for either of them to stand on. Jean and Reiner fight side by side after this for most of the final battle, with Jean actually saving Reiner from near death at the hands of Berthold's Colossal, as Jean dangles from Eren's ribcage, barely holding Reiner from falling to his death. But when Reiner asks Jean if he thinks they can still win this fight, Jean answers with an honest nope. But he still tells Reiner that they should keep fighting anyway. We're still Scout Regiment, he says. Scouts don't know when to quit. Again, calling back to Eren's speech in Season 1, a speech that Jean tried so hard to deny had any effect on him the night that it was made. But that aside, this is such a great moment for both of these characters, and for me, this is what the show has been building up to this whole time. First, in this moment, Jean finally becomes the leader that Marco believed he would be. His fear and his hopelessness are fully on display, but it's nothing compared to his resolve to keep fighting despite them. Second, Jean is now fulfilling a similar role for Reiner that Marco once fulfilled for him, in simply believing in somebody who clearly doesn't really believe in themselves that much. And you can see and hear how much Jean's words of saying that Reiner is Scout Regiment, even after everything. You can see how much that means to him, and it's such a beautiful moment. You know that being a scout meant more to Reiner than being a warrior, 100%. I don't think this scene is about Jean forgiving Reiner. As Jean said, neither of them can really judge each other at this point, especially after Jean now realizes how painful and difficult and complex it is to have to kill people that were your friends. Forgiveness and revenge are out of the question. They're not even on the table anymore. I think this scene is just full-blown acceptance for a person as they are, for the past as it is, combined with just the simple belief in that person in the present moment. Jean is seeing Reiner for who he is and what he can do. He sees the potential in him. It's a lot like Marco and how his ability to see the best in others was a lot of the time, what ultimately inspired them. That's what inspired Jean, after all, and why he's even here. Jean does the same for Reiner in this moment, and I would argue that that one conversation was the difference between victory and defeat. Reiner's resolve came from that simple moment of acceptance and belief from someone else who was strong enough to push through weakness, the weakness of their anger, fear, and hopelessness. And Reiner fights like a machine after this. The power of being believed in and supported by your friends and family, something that Reiner has never really had. Jean completes his journey for me in this moment. He finally becomes a full-blown leader. It's downright heroic what he does. Marco was 100% right about him. After this, the hardest decision of the act is made. As the allies regroup with Falco and Annie and Gabby, they all realize that Eren will have to die. But only Jean can ultimately tell Mikasa this truth. He hesitates and almost bites down on the words before telling Mikasa that there's no way they can talk him down. Even he wanted to believe they could still talk him down. You can see the pain on Jean's face, knowing how much it hurts Mikasa. From a kid who despised Eren to eventually becoming good friends with him, it hurts on that level too. Mikasa, I think, at this point, knows how much Jean cares for her, but also knows how even-keeled he is. His choked up telling her that they have to kill Eren is what forces her to face the inevitable. When Jean detonates the bomb to sever Eren's head, he screams at him that he's a goddamn suicidal bastard. That same nickname from when they were kids. You can feel the pain in Jean's voice when he does this. But he was still willing to deal what they thought could have been the killing blow to Eren, so that Mikasa didn't have to. And then, when that plan fails, Jean is faced with the fact that he's about to become a Titan. He doesn't cower like he would have in Season 1. Instead, he goes to Connie and puts his arm around his friend. The only other normal, average person in this group of really overpowered people. And Connie admits to Jean here, half joking, but I think partially serious, that Jean is the reason why he joined the Survey Corps. Jean was why he felt inspired enough to stand and resist his fear, which is such a sweet moment. And then, after, when they see Sasha again for that brief moment when they're human again, you're damn right Jean is there to hold Connie as he cries. That man will never let his friends down for as long as they live. Jean came a long way. From being that douche that no one liked, to being the leader they all needed when the time came. There's no better commanding officer of these soldiers than Jean Kirstein. He's a wonderful example of how heroism doesn't need to be grand and golden. It can be just as simple as doing the right thing no matter how hard it is, no matter how difficult it is to work yourself up to do it. If Armin is the brain of the Survey Corps, then I think Jean is its heart. The world has a way of destroying the stagnant. The only thing that doesn't change about it is how cruel it is. But for those who have the eyes to see, it has its beauties too. It has joy and it has peace. But finding those things and truly seeing them and appreciating them is up to you. Jean Kirstein did find those eventually, and he deserves a rest. I'm sure his ultimate ending wasn't exactly what he pictured for himself. Now he's an ambassador to Paradise, but I'm sure he lived happily. Whether or not he lived out his life with Mikasa is up for debate, but to me, I think he did. I don't know, when I see those ending montage scenes of the tree and Mikasa coming back to visit and the man that she's with, that just looks like Jean to me. If it's not canon, I don't care. It's my canon. Jean lived the years of his early adulthood in extremely challenging, horrific situations. As he struggled the whole time with his own fear, his selfish desires, and his own limitations. All very human things that none of us are free of. Having weaknesses or wants does not make you weak. They're just a part of who we are. And they're not all we are, because with these comes a part of human nature that makes us truly remarkable. the ability to overcome those weaknesses in order to do what we know and feel in our guts is right. Nobody is perfect in this world, and Attack on Titan routinely says this. There are devils in all of us. That doesn't make us inherently evil, but it's that capacity for injustice, ignorance, and selfishness that also allows us to be better.